to Exodus 24, and we'll continue on and make our way through a good portion of Exodus today, hopefully. Exodus 24, we've seen last time we talked about, we had a good discussion on the Ten Commandments as kind of the summary of the law, and then other laws that kind of give us an indication that they are applications of the Ten Commandments. So we discussed like how different laws that seem very specific and that they don't have to do with anything, well, that may be how it looks like when you first look at it, but it's actually tying into one of the Ten Commandments. So, for example, setting a fire on your property and it burns part of your neighbor's property, you make restitution. That's about the eighth commandment, you shall not steal, right? So we talked about how that ties together and how the law kind of works that way. Moses gives in Exodus 23, he also gives, lays out kind of Israel's calendar as far as the three feasts that are commanded, the Feast of the Passover that they would continue to observe as a memorial of the Exodus event, the Feast of Booths, which they would stay in tents to remember the wilderness wanderings, and then the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of Pentecost, where they would honor the Lord with the first fruits of their produce of what they had farmed. Okay, and then we hear about Pentecost obviously in Acts 2 in the New Testament. Okay, then Exodus 24 is what I'm calling here the inauguration of the covenant. This is when the covenant comes into legal force in a sense. Okay, and I don't want to skip over that term. You guys know what does the word inauguration mean? What does it mean when you're inaugurating something? Yeah.
When you're given a position.
Okay, when you're given a position. Okay. What else? Any other? That's good. So we think of like inauguration with like a president, right? Or something like that. The president has like an inaugural address, like a speech he gives. Okay, but the thing is, so the president gets voted for, okay, but he doesn't officially become the president until he swears the oath of office, right? That's when he's officially inaugurated. That's when his role as president officially starts, okay? So that's what an inauguration is. It's the official, like, ceremonial beginning of something. So God has given the covenant, he's given the law, and people have said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, okay? Now it just needs this official ceremony to begin the covenant. So look at Exodus 24. And I want to talk through a few things here. It says, it's speaking from God, it says, then he said to Moses, Come up to Yahweh, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel, and you shall worship at a distance. Moses alone, however, shall come up near to the Lord, but they shall not come near, nor shall the people come up with him. Then Moses came and recounted to the people all the words of the Lord, and all the ordinances. And all the people answered with one voice, this will be important, all the words that Yahweh has spoken we will do. Okay, they repeat this a couple times. Moses wrote down all the words of Yahweh. Okay, that's important too, because sometimes people say, well, there's traditions that were from Moses that we keep also, but they weren't written down. He says, well, no, he wrote down everything that God wanted him to write down. Okay, it says, then he rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. He sent the young men of the sons of Israel, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as peace offerings to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and the other half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Okay? Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that Yahweh has spoken we will do and be obedient. So Moses took the blood of the covenant and sprinkled it on the people. Let me pause there in verse 8. Okay, so Moses goes up to the mountain. He goes up with the elders. He goes up with Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu. And then he takes down the Lord's words and he presents them to the people. And then he takes the blood from these bulls, okay? And he sprinkles the blood onto what item? He sprinkles the blood onto what?
The tabernacle?
Onto the, not the tabernacle yet, but onto the altar, right? So he covers the altar in blood. And sprinkles also, the word there, I think in English is not maybe as clear as it could be of what's really going on here. When you sprinkle something in this sense, the word could be like hurled. So this is like covering, splashing blood onto this altar, okay? Now, you need to understand that concept because when its sprinkling comes up again in just a second. Now, notice the people so the blood is covering this altar. It would have also gotten all over the book of the covenant, the law. Okay, so it's inaugurated. It's being started with this blood of a sacrifice to begin the covenant. Okay, and then what have the people? How have they responded? At least twice in this passage. What have Sophia?
Saying we will be obedient and we'll do all that is said of us.
Yeah, right. We will be obedient. All that God has spoken, we will do. Everything that God has told us, we will do. Okay, so they say this in Exodus 19:8. They say it twice here at the beginning, official beginning, the inauguration of the covenant in Exodus 24. Okay, so, and then notice verse 8, Moses said, "Behold the blood of the covenant which Yahweh has made in accordance with all these words." Okay, then Moses went up with Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders, and they saw the God of Israel, and under his feet there appeared the pavement of sapphire, as clear as the sky itself. So he calls Moses onto the mountain. The glory of God rests on the mountain. And then Moses comes down and he also sprinkles, during this act of the beginning of the covenant, he sprinkles the people with the blood. Now remember, sprinkles means hurls or splashes. So he's taking probably like a palm branch or something, and hurling blood all across the people, the crowd. Okay, so the people are being covered in blood too. This wouldn't have been a very clean ceremony. Okay, so if you guys were saying, you'd be covered, blood would be flung onto you. Okay, so this is what's going on to begin this covenant. Then Moses is going to get the instructions for the tabernacle. We'll talk about that in a second. But I wanted to point out this verse, Exodus 24:8, because this is important for where it echoes later. Behold the blood of the covenant. That sounds like something else. You have to think carefully into your memory. That sounds like something else, another similar phrase in Scripture. Behold the blood of the covenant. What does that kind of sound like? Well, it sounds like the lamb, but the similar phrasing, the similar language. Who else says this? Yeah.
The Son of, he says, behold the Son of God.
Well, that's true, but behold I think the behold is tripping us up, but who talks about the new covenant? I'll say it this way. This is the covenant. Macy?
This is the covenant in my blood.
Yeah.
Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me.
Yeah, look at, somebody read Matthew 26:28. Wants to read Matthew 26:28. Somebody want to read that for us?
26.
Macy, you want to read that for us?
Sure. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins.
Right, there you go. That's fine. So Jesus says, this is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for the forgiveness of sins. This is my body, this is my blood, right? And then Macy already pointed out, this would be in 1 Corinthians 11 as well, which is actually earlier than the book of Matthew. When it was written, Paul quotes the statement of Jesus where he says, this is the covenant in my blood, right? As often as you drink, do it in remembrance of me. Okay, so when is that recited when at church? During communion. Yeah, the Lord's table, right? So what Jesus is doing here is he's stepping into like a role like Moses. Behold the blood of the covenant. Well, Jesus, as he starts the Lord's table, he says he's announcing the new covenant. He says, this is the new covenant in my blood. So that's the language that Jesus is picking up on. Moses started the old covenant, the blood of the bulls, right? Hurls it over the people. The book of the covenant gets sprinkled. The altar. Jesus says, "This is the new covenant in my blood," right? So he brings in the new covenant, just like Moses was the mediator of the old covenant. And then Moses goes up on the mountain to receive the law and the instructional booklet. I'm saying it's kind of a joke, but instructional booklet for what? He gets a guide to create what? What is Moses and people, what are they going to have to build? Yeah.
Israel?
Well, yeah, that's true, but they're going to have to build
Temple.
Prior to the temple will pick up tabernacle. Yeah, the temple is the more permanent building, right? The tabernacle, right? So they get the instructions in Exodus 25 through about 31 for not only the tabernacle, but the instructions for the priests, what the priests are supposed to wear, how they're supposed to, hey, gentlemen, pay attention please, how they're supposed to enter the tabernacle, so that they don't die, the sacrifices that they're supposed to make, what the Sabbath is for, all this stuff. They get the instructions, and God says to them, make it after this pattern. Okay? So he tells them, make it after this pattern that God gives him the instructions for. Let me read Exodus 25. Verse 9 says, according to all that I'm going to show you as the pattern for the tabernacle and the pattern for all its furniture, just so you shall construct it. Okay? Now that word pattern is going to be important because the author of Hebrews is going to pick up on it. And the author of Hebrews is going to make the argument that the pattern is modeled after the reality in heaven. That the tabernacle on earth is modeled after the pattern that God has in heaven, where it's a true tabernacle. So Jesus, Hebrews talks about Jesus as the high priest, okay? Except he's not in the priestly line, so he's the priest king, right? Like Melchizedek in Genesis, okay? Did Jesus ever go into the Holy of Holies, the tabernacle, or the temple on earth? No. So the author of Hebrews says he didn't enter in there, but when he died and rose again, he went back into heaven, which is the true tabernacle. So that's the author of Hebrews picks up on this word, that Moses constructs it after a pattern, that what is in heaven is supposed to be matched on earth by this tabernacle. That's why Moses had to follow the directions exactly. So you guys will do your project on this of what was inside the tabernacle. How is it built? What does it look like? What's supposed to be going on with this thing? So they have these different things here: the Ark of the Covenant, the table of showbread, where they had this bread regularly set on it, the golden lampstand, curtains, these veils and screens, the court of the tabernacle, the altar, chapter 28, what the priests are supposed to wear, how they're supposed to consecrate themselves and the sacrifices they're supposed to offer in 29, the food for the priests in 29, the incense on chapter 30, And then who's supposed to build the tabernacle in 31? Okay, so Moses gets all this instruction. He includes it in the book of Exodus. And then what's the next big of... okay, so let's talk about the ending to Prince of Egypt. Okay, remember the ending of the movie where it's all like nice and it's like, okay, they're finally free and Moses is coming down and all the people are happy. What was the problem? I think you guys spotted it. Yeah.
He's about to come down the mountain where they're worshiping a golden calf.
Right. When he goes up and receives really the full law and the instructions for the tabernacle, what's going on down there is not just that they're being free and honoring God, living their lives, that they're turning against God, rebelling against God, and worshiping the golden calf. Okay, in Exodus 32. So the real question here is as we get toward the end of Exodus, is this really going to work? Because God has done his part. He's saved Israel. He's brought them out. He's creating them as a nation. He's kept, he's done the signs and wonders. He's kept his side and done everything for them. Now he's given them their law, and they keep saying to God what? When he gives them the law and the covenant. What have they promised? To obey. All that Yahweh has spoken we will do. But as soon as Moses goes away for 40 days, 40 nights to receive the law and instructions for the tabernacle, immediately they turn into sin and rebellion, breaking arguably the first two commandments, either one or the other or both. And so the question is this really going to work? Can they really be the kingdom of priests and the holy nation? Is that going to be sufficient? Because we know that sinful people don't do well with the law of God. Okay, so turn to Exodus 32, and let's look at this narrative here of what happens. So God gives Moses the tablets, at the end of 31, the tablets of the testimony, one for God, one for the people, written by the finger of God. Then 32:1. Now when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled about Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us a god who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Okay, so obviously it's sinful here. This is bad. But what do you see here that's even in their statement that's just stupid, that shows the foolishness of idolatry? What does their statement say that shows why idolatry is stupid, even though we tend toward that? Yeah.
It says, "Come, make us a god who will go before us," even though God is already before them. Like,
okay.
Right in front of them.
Number one, they already have God who's right there with them. But what's they already show why idolatry is so pointless. Yeah.
He said, "Make us a god."
Yeah, make us a god. And why is that show why idolatry is stupid?
Because, you can't really make something much more powerful than yourself.
Right. So they're saying to Aaron, make us a god who's going to go before us like God and lead us, like they did in the Exodus. But you see the problem is, if you can make something and manipulate something and create something, then you're greater than that thing. So it can't be the God to rule over you and help you. Isaiah and Jeremiah will point this out to Israel. Jeremiah will be like, and Isaiah will talk about, you go into a forest and cut down a tree, and you use part of the wood to build stuff, or part of the wood to make a fire and to have food and cook your food with, and that's fine. But then you carve the rest of it, and you say, okay, this is my God now, and you say, save me from trouble and help me and do these things for me and stuff like this. So you see the foolishness there of idolatry, that people try to bring God down to their level or make something to be a God to save them. Yeah, Sophia?
Question.
Yeah.
So, what's the sin when he broke the 10 Commandments?
Moses?
Yes.
No. Eli, you need to stop doing that.
Sorry, I'm trying to fix it.
Okay, well,
The pen's a little cracked, so like if you.
I get it, but it's been 3 or 4 times that thing's sprung up. Sophia, what was your question? Oh, when Moses broke the tablets? No, I don't think it was a sin. I think it was... I'm sure Moses was angry, but I think anger is not really the point there. I think the point is when he breaks the tablets of the covenant, what does that indicate about the situation?
The covenant.
Covenant is off. Covenant is broken. Does that make sense? So it's kind of a symbol for the people that this is done, and so God gives him another set of tablets. Moses does sin at other times, but yeah, I don't think that's the issue really when he's breaking the tablets. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good one. Okay, so let's look further at this. Look at verse 2. It says, "Then Aaron said to them, 'Tear off the gold rings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me.' Then all the people tore off the rings which they had in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he took them from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made it into a molten calf. And they said, 'This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt.'" So why I say they probably here, arguably they're breaking both the first and second commandment, but I say the focus here is probably that they're breaking more the second commandment. Maybe more so than the first. It's a little bit debatable, but what is the second commandment? Macy?
To have no graven images.
No graven images, yeah. I think they are trying potentially to worship the true God through an image, okay? Because they say, this is the God who brought you up from Egypt, right? So they're claiming that this is God, right? Yeah.
Wasn't this before they knew the 10 Commandments, though?
Well, they haven't received the law yet, but Moses has already given the commandments, but it's not necessarily in order. So yeah, they haven't received the full tablets. The covenant has been inaugurated, and Moses has read it to them, but I don't think God has written it down on the tablets yet. Yeah.
So could there be a defense that they didn't really know that they weren't allowed, couldn't make graven images of God if they were trying to replicate the true God?
Well, I think Moses has already given them the basics of the law. I think God is now just writing it down on the official tablets of the covenant. Does that make sense? That's a good question, though. Okay, so then he says, okay, he took and fashioned it. This is the God who brought you out of Egypt. Now, when Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation saying, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to Yahweh." Okay, so he's saying that we're worshiping Yahweh, we're just worshiping through this golden calf. So the next day they rose up early and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people, this phrase is key here, even though it's not obvious already what it's saying. The people sat down to eat and to drink and rose up to play. Okay, so now that doesn't sound that bad, but this is a frenzy of false pagan worship that would have included sexual sin, that would have included lack of self-control, that would have included drunkenness. That's what is in this phrase. They sat down to eat, rose up to drink, and rose up to play. Okay, so that's what's going on here. And so it talks about that the people are out of control. It will say that in a minute. Then God responds and tells Moses what's going on. It says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses and said, 'Go down at once, for your people whom you have brought up from the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves.'" It's kind of funny. I don't know if your parents ever say "Do you know what your son did today or your daughter did today?" But God says to Moses, he doesn't call them my people, which is important because God has said that before throughout Exodus. He says, your people have corrupted themselves. And look at verse 8. He says, "They have quickly turned aside from the way which I had commanded them. They have made for themselves a molten calf, and they have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt.'" Okay, so, yeah, you see.
Oh, can I go to the bottom?
Yeah, that's fine. So, and notice that it says not just that they eventually got tired of obeying God. God says they have quickly turned aside from the way which I have commanded them. Okay, so it's like it's one thing. It's still wrong, but it's one thing if like have you like ever like committed to something you were really committed at the beginning, but you started to kind of like taper off, not be as interested, not be as committed later on. Okay, that's fairly common. Okay, it's whether or not you are really committed. It shows over time, and that can be bad or good depending on what thing is. You just may lose interest in something, but they disobeyed and this badly only after a period of 40 days. So they're like, which is, to be fair, it's 40 days is quite a bit of time, right? It's over a month. But they immediately turn to sin, idolatry, and this pagan worship. And so the question here is not only, okay, what is God going to do? Is he going to judge his people? But also, is this covenant with them really going to work positively? We know it'll work negatively. God will be faithful to what he has said either way. He says, I'll judge you if you break the commandments. I'll bless you if you keep the commandments. But it doesn't really look like they're going to keep the commandments. And so Israel's going to be stuck in a position where they are under their agreement to the law, but they can't keep the law, right? So this is going to be a problem. Okay, we'll look at verse 9. What God provokes Moses, he says, Then Yahweh said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, they are an obstinate people. Now let me alone, that my anger may burn against them, that I may destroy them and make you a great nation. Okay, now God says, okay, here is what the consequences should be. Moses, you shouldn't even ask me. You know what is right, what their sin demands, and what the judgment for this type of sin ought to be. I should destroy them all and start over with you and make you a great nation. And who did God say that phrase to before? I will make you a great nation. Abraham. So he's saying, okay, you're going to start over as kind of the new Abraham, and we'll start this whole thing going again. Okay. Now God knows what he's going to do, but he wants Moses to sit with the consequences of what is appropriate because of sin, right? Sometimes you do that. I don't have kids of my own, but you do this with kids sometimes when they do something that's wrong. You say, okay, well, what would be right in this situation given what you've done? And you kind of let them sit with, this is what is appropriate to what you have done, even if you're not going to follow through on the full consequences, right? But God is trying to provoke Moses into a role on behalf of his people. And so what's he trying to do, Vivian?
He's trying to make him a mediator.
Yeah, he's trying to provoke Moses. He's saying, Moses, this is what I'm going to do to get Moses to act like the mediator, to pray on behalf of the people. Okay, so this shows that Moses' role gets developed further and sets the pattern for Scripture, but also for what Christ does, is stepping in as a better, a superior mediator to Moses. Okay, so Moses prays to God, and notice what he argues in his prayer. His prayer to God. Look at verse 11. Then Moses entreated Yahweh his God and said, O Yahweh, why does your anger burn against your people whom you have brought out from the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak, saying, with evil intent he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to destroy them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and change your mind about the harm to your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by yourself and said to them, I will multiply your seed as the stars of the heaven and as this land which I have spoken to give your seed, that they shall inherit it forever. Okay, so yeah, Abigail?
Well, I just had a question.
Yeah.
So in that, so God, of course, like you said, knew what he was going to do. But then Moses, he was kind of, I mean, it was dependent on like the nation like dying or not. But he was kind of like telling God what to do almost. So why do you think that he was that bold? If he like knew that he was God?
I think he just knew how serious the situation was. So God says, Moses, this is what he's going to do. So he's inviting Moses into that position to say, God, please don't do this. Change your mind. You can't do this because it would be inconsistent with what you've promised. Does that make sense? And so he makes, that's a good question, because he makes he makes two lines of argument. And God already knows these things, but he wants Moses to recognize and act this way on behalf of the people. And so what does God argue first with Moses? What does Moses argue first with God? What does he pray first? That you can't do this, God, because... Why? Yeah.
It would be going back on your word.
It'd be going back on your word. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's true. But what does he specifically talk about? Yeah.
It would ruin his reputation.
He'd ruin his reputation before who?
His enemies.
His enemies. Yeah. So that's why I put here. God's reputation, his enemies. God, please don't let the Egyptians be able to conclude from you judging them. I know that it's your righteous judgment, but please don't let them be able to say that you brought them out of Egypt just to kill them out here and say, okay, well, obviously God's not that great. He brought them out from Egypt to kill them in the mountains. He says, God, honor your reputation in among the nations. Okay, and then he also argues, what's the second thing that he says, God, I know you're consistent with this. What is the second thing? Vivian, you already mentioned it, but yeah, Sophia? Abrahamic covenant. Remember Abraham. Remember Isaac. Remember Israel, your servants, who you said you will multiply their seed, make them a nation, give them this land. They're on the way to the land. But this generation's not going to make it into the land. You guys know that, right? They're going to die in the wilderness. Right? The next generation will go into the land. Okay? So he argues this, and God obviously responds, that God honors Moses' request. But judgment does take place because of this. Okay, so look at verse 14. So the Lord changed his mind about the harm which he said he would do to his people. Then Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of testimony in his hand, tablets which were written on both sides, and they were written on one side and the other. Then the tablets were God's work and were written, and the writing was God's writing engraved on the tablets. Now when Joshua heard the sound of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, there is a sound of war in the camp. So remember Joshua and the other elders, some of them are up there, not fully on the mountain with Moses, but nearby. But he said, it is not the sound of the cry of triumph, but the sound of the cry of defeat. But I hear the sound of singing. Eli?
How do we conclude that God is, when it says that God changed his mind, that God actually didn't change his mind?
That God doesn't change his mind?
Because we know that God doesn't change at all. What's
right.
the difference between that and what it says there?
Right. So there are some scriptures that say, like Malachi 3:6 or other things that say, I, the Lord, do not change. Right? So what God is saying here is he presents Moses this statement of here's what should happen. And presumably, theoretically, he could have, I guess, killed them all and started over with Moses. Okay? But God says, okay, here's what should happen. Moses prays, and it says God changes his mind about the destruction that he was going to do to these people. So that God says, okay, here is what is appropriate for sin at times, even though God knows what he's going to do. It says here that he changes his mind, but it doesn't mean that God has changed in his nature or that he's changed in his character in any way. It just means that God has said, okay, here's what should happen, but here's what I'm going to do, and that appears in this language as a change of mind. Does that make sense? Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, because sometimes people will say, okay, well, see, does God change or does he not? Well, no, God doesn't change, but he will sometimes present something for a certain reason and, allow the response to take place, and then, he will do something else, right? So, but that's a good question. Okay, so look at verse 19. It says, it came about as soon as Moses came near the camp, he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger burned, and he threw the tablets from his hand and shattered them at the foot of the mountain. Okay, so remember what I said. Broken tablets means what? Broken covenant, yeah. So now Moses, this is kind of it's bad, but it's also kind of funny. Look at verse 20. He took the calf, which they had made, and he burned it with fire, ground it to powder, and scattered it over the surface of the water, and made the sons of Israel drink it. So it's like, enjoy, which I didn't pick up on that detail until this morning either. Verse 21, then Moses said to Aaron, what did this people do to you that you have brought such a great sin upon them? So now he goes to the man responsible. Aaron said, now Aaron's explanation is also bad but kind of funny. Aaron said, do not let the anger of my Lord burn. You know this people yourself, that they are prone to evil. So that's true. And he said, for they said to me, make a God for us who will go before us, for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So everything Aaron said here is true, and he shouldn't have done this, but you have to, we can have a little bit of appreciation that Aaron is approached by a mob of people demanding that he make them a god, right? It's if you had thousands of people coming to you demanding that you do something, and they're out of control, you can imagine the difficulty he was under, okay? But he sins as well, and then he gets stupid with his explanation here. Look at verse 24. I said to them, whoever has any gold, let him tear it off, and they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. Do you guys see do you see what's dumb about that explanation?
That's impossible.
It's impossible? Yeah, Abigail? Yeah, he's like, I threw the gold in there, and then this calf walked out of it. And so he's like, I don't know, that's what happened. So it says before he engraved, he fashioned it. Now he's like, I just dumped all the gold in the fire, and out came this calf. It wasn't my fault, So I love it because it's just funny, but it also shows there's this phrase that you say sometimes that sin makes you stupid. And it's true. Sin makes you stupid. You say stupid things to excuse our sin. Okay. Now, when Moses saw that the people, that they were out of control, for Aaron had let them get out of control to be a derision among their enemies, then Moses stood at the gate of the camp and said, whoever is for the Lord, come to me. All the sons of Levi gathered to him, and he says, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, every man of you put his sword upon his thigh, and go back and forth gate to gate in the camp, and kill every man his brother, every man his friend, and every man his neighbor. So the sons of Levi did as Moses instructed. About 3,000 men fell that day. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so there is a judgment that takes place, and there's a further judgment because God says, I'm going to smite and kill everybody who engaged in this. So there were some who probably didn't engage in this, and there were some who did. But the sons of Levi, Moses says, as the people are out of control, everybody who's for Yahweh, come to me. Sons of Levi show up, and he says, okay, grab your sword and indiscriminately go gate to gate, back and forth in the camp, kill everybody who is participating. Even if it's your brother, son, friend, neighbor, whoever you see doing this, until the frenzy and lack of control stops. And so 3,000 people die because of this. So this is kind of ominous for us because it's like, okay, this is the beginning. It can only get what from here? Worse from here. So that's the problem is this covenant, can Israel really be the kingdom of priests and the holy nation? Is this going to work? God's going to keep his end, but we know they're not going to keep theirs. And so that's going to be an issue coming up. Okay, so we got to